My name is Jeff Morgan. I am from Dallas, Texas. I'm down in Austin, Texas, and I have the great privilege of talking with Chloe Cole. Chloe, it's so good to meet you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. Now, where are you from? Are you from California?
Yeah, I'm from California. I'm from the Central Valley. I live in Manteca.
Okay, got it. Well, thank you for being here and coming out for this conference. I've wanted to talk with you for such a long time. I've watched a lot of your video interviews. Tried to see you at CPAC. It just didn't work out. But anyway, it's so glad to have the opportunity to talk with you. Do you want to give just maybe like a brief 30-second recap of what your life is? Because a lot of people know, but some people don't. But I want to ask you some other questions that I don't think you're typically asked.
Sure. So I call myself a detransitioner, meaning that I am somebody who went through the process of going through a gender transition. And I decided to permanently stop and go back to living my life as a woman. And I went through the whole process of transitioning and even of detransitioning while I was still a kid, before I'd even turned 18. I started socially transitioning, and I changed my name at 12 years old, before at 13 going on puberty blockers and testosterone. And at 15, I underwent a double mastectomy, meaning that my breast had been surgically removed. And at 16 years old, I decided to stop transitioning because I wanted to become a mother.
Right.
I wanted to have a family of my own one day. And I wouldn't be able to do that, obviously, if I'm on treatments that are affecting my fertility. And by living as a man, I mean, what were my kids going to call me? Was I going to be dad? Was I going to be mom? And I was losing more parts of myself as a child, as an adult, before I could even call myself that.
Right. No, I got it. And I've heard from your testimony that you said that some of the doctors told your parents that if they did not affirm your gender identity crisis that you were going through, that you would be more likely to commit suicide. But from what I've heard of what you've said, you never really had any thoughts of suicide until you got on the puberty blockers and stuff. Is that correct?
Right. And yeah, I wasn't really suicidal before that point. I was a perfectly healthy kid. I mean, granted, I had some days that were worse than others, but what teenager doesn't?
Yeah, exactly.
But when not like those natural ebbs and flows with like the hormonal cycle that kids that age go through,
right.
I wasn't going through that anymore. In fact, like now that I was on testosterone, it was very difficult for me to regulate my emotions, especially the negative ones like anger and sadness. Right. And I couldn't even cry anymore.
Really?
And now, like, that I was abiding by, like, male social norms, it was difficult to fit into, and now I didn't really have as much room to talk about my own personal struggles, so I just kept going down this downward spiral after about, like, a year or so of being on it.
Right, and one of the things that people have said is that puberty is the cure for what they call gender dysphoria.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Yes.
Yeah, even though puberty can be hard because your body's changing. There's a lot of things you don't know what's going on and everything like that.
It's difficult for everybody. And a lot of these kids are dealing with either completely normal feelings or that combined with past traumas, comorbid conditions like autism, sexual or familial trauma. Right. And yet during the diagnostic process or even during treatment, the doctors just look the other way.
Right. And I really wanted to explore that area just a little bit, the area of trauma. One of the things that I understood you saying is that you had a little bit of autistic characteristics or autism. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, I've struggled to get like an official diagnosis for it throughout pretty much my whole life, because each time the doctors just kept telling me, my mom and dad, basically that I was like too smart or like too socially developed or too too verbally developed. So they basically said, like, you're not stupid enough. Yeah. Even though most people on the high functioning end of the spectrum tend to be more intelligent than average. Right. But I had a lot of my symptoms were self-stoming, some social difficulties, sensory difficulties, and some differences in my cognition, especially compared to other girls. Because a lot of autistic girls exhibit more stereotypically like boyish or tomboyish behaviors, and they tend to be more object-oriented than like socially oriented like their other female peers. Right. And that's one thing that really affected me growing up. And I felt like if I knew this from a younger age, I wouldn't have had as much of a crisis with my identity as a woman.
So the other thing that I heard you say, one of two other things I heard you say, is I believe that you had some type of a period or incidence where you were almost being sexually abused or something, or molested at school or something along those lines.
Yeah, in my 8th grade year, it was a very complicated situation. I had been groped by a classmate of mine who had been bullying me throughout the school year, and I felt like I couldn't tell anybody about it because I mean the staff at school, they already were refusing to help me with like my IEP, my 504 plan that my parents like fought to put in place. Right. So how could I ask them to help me with feeling comfortable after having been assaulted in their school, especially because the classroom was full. There was a teacher and there were pretty much all my classmates in there. Nobody reported it. Nobody even batted an eye. So it made me feel like I was small and insignificant, and I couldn't get justice. And I was also already in the mindset of like, well, I'm a boy, so I have to man up. And the situation just, even though I had largely forgotten about it by the time I entered high school, it was still at the back of my mind. And a lot of the decisions I would make, like, I was afraid of being taken advantage of like that ever again. And so I opted to hide my breasts and pretty much any sign that I ever was female. Right. No, I remember I think you were talking with Jordan Peterson about that, if I remember the interview correctly. At least to some degree you were. And one of the reasons I'm exploring this, because I don't think people realize to what degree those people that promote this transitioning philosophy are actually picking upon people who've gone through abuse or trauma in their own lives. And I think it's very exploitive. I think it's abusive. And people that are saying, well, they just want to be trans, they identify as this, ignore the fact that in many, many instances, there has been abuse in their lives or some type of trauma, and they're making things worse, not better. That's absolutely what it is. I mean, it really comes down to just being a Band-Aid treatment for these people, other psychiatric issues. That are just being completely ignored by the doctors that are supposed to help them. Pretty much every single transgender person or detransitioner who I've ever met was either abused by a family member physically or emotionally or otherwise, or they had been victim to sexual assault. Either one of those two or both. Right. It's one of the secrets that the industry does not want out there, because people would say, you're abusing our kids. You're abusing these people, but they're trying to be so affirming and loving and kind. And the people that defend against these barbaric practices are being stigmatized when you're the victims of it. But let me ask one other question too. I heard you today talking a little bit about your family. There was a large age gap between you and your youngest older sibling. Is that correct? Yeah. Tell me a little bit about that. You had how many children in your family? 5 kids. So kids. I was the youngest of 5 kids. So you were okay. There was an age gap of maybe like about 6 to 8 years. Okay. So that's pretty significant. And I mean, for the most part, I think we all got along pretty well. I mean, sometimes we would have our squabbles, but like what siblings don't, you know? But I mean, that age gap just kind of served to like make it so that it was harder to relate to them and for them to relate to me at times. And they didn't always want me around when like their friends were over, like when they just wanted to do their own thing. Because for a lot of my childhood, they already were teenagers. And by the time I was in 5th grade, pretty much everybody was already moved out. So I didn't really feel like I had anybody to confide in at home. Now, my understanding is as well, what I heard you say today is that they were your stepbrothers and sisters, or was it? Half siblings. Half siblings. So tell me a little bit about that. And like your parents then, were they both on their second marriage or their third marriage? Or what I really want to talk about and what I focus on is the importance of family structure. Yes. And usually when there is a situation like divorce that takes place or a family is never formed, that immediately sets the children at risk for some of these issues that you've talked about, whether it be trauma, whether it be abuse, whether it be confusion. When we were at CPAC, we had a booth. I was at the booth with dealing about the epidemic of fatherlessness, but we transitioned, sorry to use a term like that, to the booth that talks about the gender transition industry. Because if a child does not form his identity with both parents in the household,
they're confused, and that leaves them more vulnerable to saying, I'm trans, I'm this, I'm that.
Right, and that's kind of a pattern that I've seen with a lot of my transgender friends, especially from high school. My parents they still are together, but I mean, some of my older siblings didn't really have it so lucky. Like on my dad's side, his ex-wife pretty much had nearly full custody of my older brother and my older sister on that side. And so I never really got to see them growing up, and I miss them a lot. But I mean, unbeknownst to me, like, they were going through a lot with their mother. And like, when dad would have custody of them, she would manipulate them into thinking they were sick or something, that they had to go back home for whatever reason.
Right. Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. And I didn't know, because I've never heard anybody discuss that with you or ask you that question. Because from all the stuff that we've done, I mean, we fight for family integrity. We want to reduce divorce. Never said get rid of divorce, but we have to be honest and say that if people get divorced, or if they have a child out of wedlock and don't form a family, that child is at risk.
Right. And I mean, even if I wasn't directly experiencing any of that, just like seeing the effects of it on my older siblings, and I feel like that probably had some impact on my feelings about family in general growing up.
Right. I know we have to wrap up pretty quickly here. The medical industry basically tried to convince your parents that if they did not affirm you and put you through the treatments, you might commit suicide.
Yes.
We had a legislator down here a few years ago that I testified in front of that brought up the suicide issue. And I mentioned the Swedish study, said if you really want to talk about suicide, those who go through transitioning actually have a higher rate of suicide.
It goes up.
It goes up considerably.
And that was a study done on adults.
Yes.
It was long-term.
In a country that was very friendly toward this.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, in Sweden.
And yet they still were more likely to commit suicide afterward.
Yeah.
If that's the results that we're getting in adults, how do we expect any better for kids?
Right, right.
Especially since it's more dangerous the younger that you go.
Right. Right, absolutely, absolutely. And it also becomes a larger source of income long-term for the pharmaceutical industry, for the medical industry. So one final thing here, then I'll let you go, because we've talked about a number of things here, the medical industry, but there's another issue that I know is probably not on your radar yet. Maybe it is, because you kind of talked about it. We look at the family court issues, because family courts also destroy families.
Yes.
We actually have a person right now, maybe you know him, Jeff Younger is the father of twins, and we had a judge in Dallas, Texas, Mary Brown, who basically let the mother, who was the non-biological mother, take the kids to California, and she's planning to transition one of them. Sometime in the future, you might want to look at that as well. What I do want to say is this, that obviously we're thankful that you're here. We're thankful that you're a voice. I heard some of your plans. To me, it's amazing that you're relatively normal. I'm sorry to say that, but you know what I mean. Because of
it's a lot.
It's been a lot. But we wish you nothing but the best going forward. If there's any final message you'd like to leave the people that are watching this, what would it be?
I mean, in my life, I've lost quite a bit. I've lost years of development, potentially years off my life, and even entire organs. But the one thing that I learned through it all is that no matter what you lose, there's always going to be so much more to gain, to live for in the world. There will always be something to fight for.
Well, thank you, Chloe. And by the way, Chloe is 19 years old, right?
Yes.
You know, you present yourself with such poise, and I just want to say thank you once again for being here. We're very glad that you're here, and know that you have a nation pulling behind you. Even though there are people that will attack you, you have a nation pulling behind you, so you have that support. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.